Bueno, buenas tardes, bienvenidos todos. Hoy vamos a hablar con Martin Amis. La conversación va a ser en inglés, pero todos ustedes tienen la posibilidad de la traducción simultánea. Después vamos a hablar con unos 40 minutos, una cosa así, y después habrá un turno de preguntas y podrán preguntar ustedes en inglés y en español, como prefieran. Bueno, first of all, welcome Martin.
Gracias. Yo siento mucho. Puedo hablar una o dos palabras. Puedo decir yo no sé nada. Puedo decir no puedo ayudar. Puedo decir pero entiendo nada. Hables demasiado rápido. Por favor. Entonces, vale.
Okay, first of all, welcome back to Europe, because you've been living in Uruguay for about 3 years.
That's right.
Uruguay being my country, so I'm very happy you were there. And I must say, you weren't living in a large city. You weren't living in Montevideo. You were living in José Ignacio. And I will briefly explain to our friends of the festival what kind of place José Ignacio is. Él vivía en un sitio que se llama José Ignacio, que está cerca de Punta del Este. Es un sitio muy curioso porque durante los 3 meses de verano es muy jet set, muy mundano, con los hombres y las mujeres más guapos que ustedes han visto nunca, y no estoy exagerando, realmente Punta del Este es así. Y después, los 9 meses siguientes es todo lo contrario, es un sitio completamente solitario, incluso frío, porque el clima es así, hace frío en Punta del Este. Entonces, I was explaining, this contrast with the summer and the winter in José Ignacio. And I wanted to ask you, Martin, being away from the maddening crowd for about 3 years, does this change your insight of things, of politics, of the world, and of literature as well?
Well, if it does, then it will take a couple of years before that remoteness is processed by your consciousness and your body. I mean, funnily enough, writing is much more physical than people understand. It takes, that's about the average period it takes for a novelist or any writer, imaginative writer, to absorb something. Coming from José Ignacio, this little fishing village, to London, which we've now done, is rather shocking. But again, I don't know whether I'll have any benefit from it for a long time. It's as with politics. The events of September the 11th are only now beginning to surface in fiction, if you notice. People are starting to write novels that don't directly address it, perhaps, but are clearly about the post-September the 11th world. And that's 5 years, and that's about how long.
Yes, but funny enough, when the terrorist attack happened, this was 5 years ago, right? You started writing a book, Street Dog, and Ian McEwan wrote Saturday, and Salman Rushdie writes. And at the time you said that you couldn't write about anything else, that somehow you had the feeling that September 11th had to be there in your books. But now you believe that's not so?
Well, I think it was like sticking your toe into a cold lake. I mean, neither I in Street Dog nor Ian in Saturday faced the subject head on. We were just beginning to describe the change in the mental atmosphere. And now I think hereafter we can do it more directly. But it does seem to me, it would seem for me to be slightly frivolous to write about middle-class anxieties, divorces, jobs, wounded ethnicity, and all the other concerns of the middle class, the bourgeois novel, without admitting and beginning to describe this completely changed world. It would seem to me evasive to do that. And also, you'd be ignoring the majority of your preoccupations, which are all to do with it.
I also heard that you thought of writing a book on Islam and you had to give it up because it was very critical. And so in a way, did this hinder your creativity? Did you have the feeling that you couldn't express exactly what you thought?
Yes, it did in a way. It was a novella or a long story that was set in Waziristan, in the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it was the narrator was a little, very diminutive, short-statured terrorist, and it was a satire. Now, the trouble with satire is that it feeds on itself, and what satire loves is taking on a total system, a totalist system, like Islam. Islam is totalist in that it makes a total claim on a believer, and every aspect of your life is determined by religion and various teachings, down in incredible detail. Islam follows you into the kitchen, what you can eat, into the bedroom, your sexual behavior, into the bathroom, which direction to sit in while you defecate. There is no aspect of life that Islam does not try to shape, and Islam, in fact, means submission. Now, once satire gets going on that, I found myself being so incredibly offensive, sort of wildly and incrementally offensive. And it was just getting, more and more insulting every page. And I was having a wonderful time. I was enjoying myself.
I hope you keep those pages.
Well, I have, but what made I could write a very long piece about why I put it aside, something I'd never done before, for an external reason.
But were you scared?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't fear of retribution. The theme of this, and the theme of a lot of things I've written about Islam in both in fiction and non-fiction, is that with terror, funnily enough, comes boredom. Terror has made a huge contribution to planetary boredom. Standing there while you take your shoes off and remove your hair gel from your hand-on luggage, while you watch as your daughter has her rucksack, your 6-year-old daughter has her rucksack searched, and there's a fluffy duck, and there's someone earnestly palpating all 4 limbs. And you sit there, and it's a feeling beyond boredom. It's a boredom not as something effete and blasé, but boredom as something, a violent emotion. And the confrontation with Islam is the confrontation with the dependent mind. And you look into these leaden faces that have submitted themselves to a belief system, and you know that you can't sit down and have an argument at the end of which someone is going to say, yes, there's a lot in what you say, I think I will change my habits. The dependent mind has been dependent for 14 centuries, and for something like 60 or 70 generations. Any hope that Islam can modernize itself is remote, and it needs a reformation, and it needs an enlightenment, and that would take perhaps 2 centuries.
But why would they change? They are winning the battle.
No, they're not. I'm glad we're in Spain as I say this, but the gross national product of all the Islamic countries is about the same as Spain's. Similarly, Spain translates more books into Spanish every year than have been translated into Arabic in 11 centuries. They are not winning in any meaningful sense. They're on every index of vitality, job creation, technology, they are on a par with countries like Réunion and Macau. that what we are dealing with is their failure. Islam came to a T-junction in their history, and to the left it said modernization, less Islam. And to the right it said the past and more Islam. It's very simple. I mean, Hassan Nasrallah today was boasting that the Hezbollah's victory over Israel was so unlikely that it can only be explained by the fact that the superpower called God had lent assistance to his forces. Islam, up until about the 13th century, was the most dynamic force on earth, an enormous success story. And they were buoyed, they were encouraged in this success by a complementary argument, which was the argument from manifest success. That their expansion, the way the religion flourished, all the way from the borders of China right up to all of Spain and right up to the Pyrenees at one point, was evidence of God's mandate. They've now had 500 years of increasingly marked failure. So this is what we're witnessing is the sort of death agony of imperial Islam. And the last surge, which says that we can't modernize, all we can do is get more and more Islamic, and that will restore God's blessing. They're like, I mean, in terms of success and likely success, they're just like the Japanese warrior caste cadres before the Second World War, before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, where the generals, looking at the gross national product of Japan and looking at that of America, said, we can raise merry hell for a couple of years, but we can't win. And they did it anyway, but that's the position.
I'd love to hear this from you, because one gets the impression that it's a very unequal war. We're fighting against a blind enemy, we don't know where we are hitting, and they don't abide by the rules, so it's hard, really.
Well, we're going to take many wounds in this war, but absolutely inconceivable that we will lose it. It will be a messy tantrum that Islam is throwing, but ridiculous and deluded idea that we're all going to convert to Islam or be executed by them, that we're going to submit to Sharia law. They can be as asymmetrical as they like, but they're not going to bring the West to its knees.
I'm really glad to hear that. Anyway, you once said that Islam had no sense of humor and they had an excess of testosterone. And that makes me think, if power has an excess of testosterone, and do you think this would be a better world when women rule it, given that we'd have no testosterone?
Well, I think you've got some testosterone recently, but
not much, not as much as you. Anyway.
No. Well, estrogen can be just as dangerous, but I for a long time I felt, let's give the women a go because we're no good. We haven't made a success of it, and I think that's the key to Islam's modernization, is that they suffer enormously from denying the talents of half their population. That's why that and institutionalized irrationality is the explanation given by Bernard Lewis in his book-length question, What Went Wrong in Islam? And I think that is the best possible outcome for Islam, is that the women stage a revolution. And there will be many martyrs in that battle. But I think with women, the novel I'm writing now, after the one you have there, which is coming out in this month, is about feminism. And it has a wonderful title that I stole from a Russian thinker and philosopher, Alexander Herzen. and it's called The Pregnant Widow. And what he said vis-a-vis revolutions in general, I'm applying it to the sexual revolution. What he said is that, when there is a revolution, when an old order gives way to a new one should feel pleased, one should welcome the next generation, so to speak, of our evolution. But he said what you don't get in these revolutions is a newborn child. What you get is a pregnant widow. The father is dead, but the child is not yet born. And he said much tribulation, much trial and tribulation lies between that situation and the birth of the new child. Now, if you look at feminism in that light, you can see that this movement is only in its second trimester, perhaps. And certainly the baby is not being born.
In Western culture, because obviously...
It's not happening at all in Eastern cultures. But, and the way I see it so far is this, is that there was a bloodless revolution, the Velvet Revolution, and a very remarkable thing, one of the most amazing convulsions in all history is that in the West, men stood back and women stepped forward without many hostilities between them. And then women...
How would you time this revolution?
I think it began in about 1970 with the publication of 3 key feminist texts, Germaine Greer and I can't remember the titles at the moment, but 2 others. It seemed like a moment when it started to roll. But then I think what happened is this, that women empowered, power corrupts. It affects the judgment. It makes you want more power immediately. And I think women gathered more power when what they should have been doing was saying, right, forget about all that. We've got more power, but what I want you to do, they should have been saying to their husbands, is do more in the house. Do more, look after children more, help run the house. They didn't do that.
Do you mean to say that they all went to work and they neglected housework?
No, it's not even that. It's
They're going to have lots of problems here,
No, they may have gone to work, but what they did was they took over the decision-making at home. And the men became quiet. They withdrew. And, I think every writer thinks that his own experience is universal, and I know my wife is here somewhere, but men learn to work around this. And, for instance, you get a huge federal document in the mail that you've got to fill out. And you go and stand near your wife and say, look, this is very forbidding document just arrived. And she'd snatch it from you, and she'd go and fill it out herself while you tiptoe from the room. And the result was that the women who were already doing a very great deal were doing absolutely everything. They're making all the decisions and making all the arrangements, working and doing the lion's share of parenting and running the house. And now they've suddenly realized, I think, around now, that they haven't benefited as much as they should have done from this revolution. They're
working too much.
They're doing, before they were doing nearly everything. Yeah. Now they're doing absolutely everything. Yeah. And also they're wondering if they want these pathetic husbands who never
don't need you anymore,
make
right?
a suggestion or raise their hands.
Yes, that's a danger. We might not need you anymore.
No. Well, who would need these wimps and these timid little tiptoeing husbands that we've become? So there has to be another go at it, and men have to take back doing some of the boring stuff of administration that they willingly...
Take it all.
Yeah,
as far as I'm concerned, take it all. Okay, let me ask you a question. It's a very boring question us women writers have to answer all the time, but never they pose this question to men. Okay? I remember once when we met in Barcelona, you told me you admire very much Jane Austen. And this question we always have to ask is, does is there such thing as feminine literature and masculine literature?
Vladimir Nabokov, said that he was entirely homosexual in his literary taste, that he didn't like women's fiction. I don't agree. The many women I admire very much, but I do think there's a difference, and I think it's just a polite fiction to pretend that their fiction is the same as our fiction. Wordsworth said that poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility. And a great critic said of this, elaborating on this, he said, if you hear of the death of a friend, you can burst into tears, but you cannot burst into song. Now, I think women are a little bit better at bursting into song than men. I think there is more song in women's fiction, that they respond, they don't need the tranquility, they don't need the 3-year absorption that men do. I think they because they're in closer touch with their emotions, that's a cliche, but cliches are true. To say that a lot of people live in China is a cliche, but it's true. And so they can respond more off the top of the head, more immediately. And that's what I admire in women's fiction.
So say, for example, if you read a book and you didn't look at the cover, didn't know who it was written by, do you think you could tell?
Not always. I think there are some very masculine women writers. Iris Murdoch, perhaps. Very cerebral, not from the heart so much as from the head. I think I probably could, but you can test me out. But,
well, I suppose that there are themes that are more feminine or masculine. Say, I don't know, Proust writings could be done by a woman, couldn't it?
Definitely, yeah. There is perhaps more, although I feel uncomfortable at once making these distinctions, but there is perhaps more responsiveness to surfaces, certainly to clothes. And I'm not defaming you, but I was astonished by how deeply, how mystically women feel about, for instance, shoes.
Well, actually, so does Flaubert, let me remind you.
What?
So does Flaubert.
Flaubert does too. But, shoe is just something you put on your foot, as far as I'm concerned. But women have this, they could write volumes about how they feel about their shoes. And most women, I notice when they travel, about half their luggage is shoes. And I hear some complicit laughter from the audience. So a little bit of that. More inner about emotion than men. I think men have such a terror of sentimentality that they avoid sentiment, which more than they should do, because they want to seem masculine. It's sort of not macho to talk about tender feelings. I think it's a pretty even balance. I think women writers have much more strength in some areas than men in others. I mean, what is historically undeniable is that, and very surprising, I think, is that women have not made the kind of contributions to poetry that men have that isn't comparable. They've made enormous contributions to fiction, but the history of women's poetry is tiny, and it's not because they're being stamped out, because they were writing the novels. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you'd think a poem would be very amenable to, Jane Austen used to write pretending she was writing letters, and she would have, under her blotting paper, she would have her manuscript. And she had to snatch 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there. And I would find that tremendously difficult if I were writing a novel, but I can imagine writing a poem in shorter bursts. And you'd have thought that that it would be, more...
Yes, that's true. And why haven't you written poetry, for example? You've written all sorts of things, all different topics, but never written poetry.
No, that's true. And my father wrote poetry as well as fiction, and we both agreed that it's the higher form, although it's now dying, of course. But when I started out, I did try to write poems. But it was... I had moments where I thought I could write a poem about this. But my preference very early on was to write a paragraph about this and not a poem. The reason poetry is dying at the moment as we speak, you could write its obituary, is because history has speeded up, not just since September the 11th, but since the Second World War, perhaps. And we want everything to move at a certain rate now. We're hopelessly addicted to momentum. And that's just what a poem doesn't give you. A poem doesn't move in time. A poem, if it's a lyric poem and not an epic, what a poem does is stop the clock. Say, right, silence, everything stops while we examine this moment, this epiphany, this realization that the poem embodies. And we don't like to do that anymore. And nor do we like the sort of introspection that a poem demands of you. The reason everyone's talking on their mobile phones all the time is not just to find out, whether you put the baked beans on at home or what video do you want from the shop. It's because they feel very uncomfortable when they're alone with their thoughts. They want to dilute themselves. And a poem is about the poet's introspection, but it is also inevitably about the reader's introspection. And we don't like